The physiology of the female reproductive system has its own name called the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is a series of changes each month that allows a female to reproduce. The menstrual cycle is a monthly series of changes that involves ovulation, changes in the uterine lining, and menstruation. On average, the menstrual cycle will last anywhere between 28 to 32 days. But whatever is normal for that individual female is normal for that individual female. It's also very normal for teenagers to have an irregular cycle, meaning that one month they might have a 28-day cycle, the next month they might have a 25-day cycle, the month after that they might have a 32-day cycle. That's really just the body's way of trying to deal with and figure out all of these new hormones and this reproduction thing that's happening, which is completely new to it. It is also normal for females to skip a period in their teenage years. And again, that's just the body's normal trying to figure out what the heck is going on. There are 4 phases to the menstrual cycle. That first phase is that menstrual phase, and this is where a female would have her period, or that shedding of the endometrium, which is that uterine lining. The second phase of the menstrual cycle is the follicular phase. This is where that ovum or egg, and as well as that follicle, which encloses that ovum, is maturing. So it's getting ready to be released during ovulation. In the middle of the cycle, that third event happens, which is ovulation. This is where that ovum bursts from the follicle and is swept up into the fallopian tube by those fimbriae, those hair-like projections on the end of the ovaries, for fertilization. The last phase of the menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, and this is where that endometrium is thickening, or that uterine lining thickens up to try to prepare the uterus for implantation of a fertilized egg. The menstrual cycle begins with the first day of menstruation. So the very first day a female has their period is day 1 of the menstrual cycle. Menstruation can usually last between 5 to 8 days, and again, that can vary from cycle to cycle and person to person, especially during those teenage years. During menstruation, the uterine lining, also known as the endometrium, is leaving the body. So there was no implantation of a fertilized egg, so that uterus no longer needs that thickening endometrium that consists of blood, tissue, and other fluids to be present to nurture and protect that fertilized ovum. So it just gets rid of it. So here's a good timeline of when the events of the menstrual cycle take place. So days 1 through 8 is menstruation. That's when that uterine lining is being shed because there was no fertilized ovum that was implanted in that uterine lining, so the body doesn't need it. At the same time, menstruation is happening as well up until the middle of the cycle. So if we think about a 28-day cycle, that's about day 14 is the middle of the cycle. An egg or ovum is maturing and continues to mature up until ovulation, which happens around day 14. So that follicle that encloses that ovum is getting bigger, as well as that ovum is being matured. Once we hit that middle of the cycle, so it's usually around day 14 for a 28-day cycle, that's when ovulation happens. So that ovum bursts from that follicle and is swept up by those fimbriae, those finger-like projections on the end of the fallopian tubes, into the fallopian tube for fertilization. After ovulation occurs, then we enter into the last phase of the menstrual cycle, which is that luteal phase. So that's when that endometrium or uterine lining is thickening to prepare for a potential fertilized ovum implantation on the uterine wall. So again, while menstruation is occurring, so while that uterine lining is being shed, an egg and follicle in the ovary is starting its maturation process. It doesn't reach its full maturation level until the very middle of the cycle. So if we're thinking about a 28-day menstrual cycle, that's going to be around day 14. So when that egg is fully mature, that's when ovulation is going to occur. At ovulation, that egg bursts from its follicle and is released into the fallopian tubes. The fimbriae on the end of the fallopian tube, those big finger-like projections, are going to act like a claw or a broom and kind of grab it and sweep it up into the fallopian tube. It does take a little while for that egg to travel through the fallopian tube and into the uterus. Usually about 4 to 14 days after ovulation is when it reaches the uterus. If the egg were to be fertilized, it's going to happen in the upper 2/3 of the fallopian tube because it has to be fertilized within 24 hours after ovulation. One other thing I want to point out is that when ovulation occurs, it usually only occurs in one ovary at a time, and typically they switch off every month. So if an egg is released from the left ovary, the next cycle or the next month, an egg will be released from the right ovary. And that's not always the case for every single female. Some females only release eggs from their left ovary. Some only release from their right ovary. Sometimes they might release for 2 cycles from the same ovary. So let's say in one case they, for 2 cycles, release an egg from their left ovary, and then the next cycle it'll be from their right ovary. It's just different for every person, which is totally normal. What is normal for that person is normal for that person. So here's a good visual representation of what happens at ovulation when that egg bursts from its follicle and is swept up into the fallopian tube by the fimbriae. What controls the whole menstrual cycle are the female reproductive sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is the primary female sex hormone and plays a role in the very first part or the very first half of the menstrual cycle. So what estrogen does is it prepares the follicle in the ovum or egg for ovulation. We'll see estrogen levels slowly increase in the first half of the menstrual cycle and peak right before ovulation, which indicates that that egg is at its most mature level, and it also helps to stimulate the release of that egg from the follicle during ovulation. Progesterone is a hormone that is responsible for changing the lining of the uterus. We see progesterone levels fairly low in the first half of the menstrual cycle, and we don't really see progesterone start to increase until the second half of the menstrual cycle because it is secreted from that temporary gland, the corpus luteum. So this yellow-bodied temporary gland appears after ovulation because that is what the follicle turns into after the egg is released from it. So progesterone will gradually increase after ovulation to prepare the uterus for a potential fertilized egg. Now, if somebody were pregnant, we would see higher levels of progesterone secreted throughout the pregnancy because the uterus is trying to maintain that uterine lining or endometrium. So I put this chart on your notes and on this last slide here because I think it does a good job showing how all the pieces of the menstrual cycle and different parts work together and what is kind of happening at the same time throughout that 28-day cycle. So we're going to start with that follicular development. At the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, that egg and follicle are at their smallest because they're just starting that maturation process. The maturation process is going to continue up until ovulation. So the follicle is at its biggest and that egg is at its most mature. At ovulation, that egg is bursting from that follicle and being swept up by the fimbriae into the fallopian tubes. The follicle turns into the corpus luteum. So this is that temporary yellow-bodied gland that secretes progesterone, which is responsible for thickening the uterine lining. And that's what appears during that luteal phase or that last phase of the menstrual cycle or the last half of the menstrual cycle. So if pregnancy were to occur, that corpus luteum would remain for the life of the pregnancy. Most often that does not happen, so instead at the end of the cycle it disintegrates and is just reabsorbed by the body to get ready for the next cycle. If we look at the hormone levels, we're going to see estrogen slowly increase during that first half of the menstrual cycle and peak right before ovulation, which makes sense because estrogen helps mature that egg and follicle, and we want that egg and follicle to be most mature right before ovulation. Estrogen also stimulates ovulation to happen, so that also makes sense. We're going to see estrogen sharply decrease right kind of as ovulation is happening and then remain relatively low for the rest of the cycle. Now, if you remember me talking about FSH and LH, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone helps to mature an ovum. Follicle-stimulating hormone causes estrogen levels to rise, so they are both going to kind of fall in line with what estrogen is doing, which makes sense. Progesterone only comes into play the second half of the menstrual cycle or during that luteal phase, because that corpus luteum appears in the second half after ovulation. So progesterone levels are going to be pretty much non-existent until after ovulation when that corpus luteum appears. That's when we see progesterone slowly increase and peak kind of in the middle of that second half of the cycle or in the middle of that luteal phase. If pregnancy were to occur, we'd see progesterone levels plateau and remain that high to maintain that uterine lining for the remainder of the pregnancy. But again, more often than not, that doesn't happen, or pregnancy doesn't happen, so we see progesterone levels decrease to get ready for the next cycle. In terms of the endometrial cycle, or how thick that uterine lining is, the first 5 or so days of the menstrual cycle is menstruation, where that uterine lining is being shed. So we see that decrease. It's going to remain relatively low during the rest of the follicular phase because that egg and ovum is maturing and we don't need uterine lining to do that. Plus the corpus luteum hasn't appeared. After ovulation, once that corpus luteum appears, secretes progesterone, which thickens the uterine lining, we're going to see the uterine lining or that endometrium thicken and line kind of as progesterone appears and peaks. If pregnancy were to occur, just like progesterone, we'd see the endometrium or that lining, uterine lining, plateau and remain that way for the life of the pregnancy. But again, more often than not, that doesn't happen. So instead, we see that uterine lining decrease just ever so slightly and gets ready for the next cycle where it is completely shed. So I hope this diagram or this chart makes it a little bit easier to understand what is happening within all of the different parts for each day of the menstrual cycle. So to end here, I have a quick video that goes over all of the information we covered about the menstrual cycle today.